the abstract that was read out to you, and this is going to be part of the focus of what I'm going to talk today. Before we move on, I want to give you two disclaimers. As ma'am has introduced, I am not a philatelist. When it comes to stamps, I'm just 12 years old. And that is the perspective from which I've always collected stamps. They are pretty little things, and from every time I've bought a stamp, I've looked into its background history and learned something about them. But if you ask me about cancellation, if you ask me about errors and all those kind of things, you will only get a blank stare from me, right? Yet I'm also a 40-year-old in this current life. So what the 12-year-old boy collects, I look at them as a 40-year-old political historian. And my interest in stamps really comes from this POV as to what do they represent of the state, because it's only the states that issue stamps. So every time a state issues a stamp, it is like saying this is officially commemorated by the state, and therefore the things that are left out are therefore what the state has chosen not to commemorate. And that will be the framework with which I will proceed with my stamp. Okay. Uh, I tried scanning my collection, but I am a terrible creature with the telephone camera. But let me start with our natural maritime heritage, okay, which is something that a oceanographer or a marine biologist would be able to better talk about. But these are the stamps the state has issued, and I'm going to talk a little about these. Okay, so the first thing that we started are the Batagur terrapin and the olive ridley turtle that you see here. The olive ridley turtle is now somewhat famous, so now you have people going on tours to the beaches where the turtle comes and where they see hundreds upon hundreds of this sadly endangered animal come and lay its eggs, and it is quite a tourist spectacle. On the other hand is the Batagur terrapin, which exists today, although once widespread in Southeast Asia and in Orissa, Bengal, and Burma. It is today very critically endangered and is reduced to spots in Burma, in Bengal, and in Orissa. Now, this stamp was issued in 2000, so after 21 years, I do not know what the status of the animal is. Have its numbers stabilized, gone up, gone down? We don't know. So these are two that the that have had stamps issued to them. Although India is a distinctly much richer place for reptiles and other sea creatures, I haven't come across a stamp to the mugger crocodile or the saltwater crocodile. Uh, so this is something I wanted to start off with because zoology has been something close to me. I've had the experience of seeing the olive ridley turtle appear on the beaches. It's pretty surreal an experience. The other things are, of course, the Indian corals. Now, as many of you would know, coral reefs are endangered all over the world, and India is no stranger to the fact that corals are endangered. In fact, the tiny bit of coral reef that we have at Worli in Bombay, for example, was a bit in the news when it came to talking about the Bombay Sea Link and how that would, the coastal road which would pass through Haji Ali would completely destroy this little bit of coral that we have. So again, something that was memorialized a long time ago. Well, every time I look at this stamp, then it gives me a slightly sad feeling as to did we do our national service to our natural heritage by issuing stamps, and then have we just forgotten about it in this race for development? Because One of the things is uh, the public seems to be divided into two camps all the time. Those that are pro-development and those who see environmental campaigners as public enemies, and of course the other side which sees all forms of development as instructions from Satan. So again, just a little square inch that can capture a lot of politics, right? Another is the mangroves, of course. And this is a lovely miniature sheet in my possession. When the Convention on Climate Change, the purpose of the miniature sheet is to memorialize the eighth session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and for which they've chosen to use these four mangroves as visual symbols. Uh, but nevertheless, India issues stamps very enthusiastically on all kinds of international conferences and events and anniversaries, and it often highlights its natural heritage in that way. Perhaps they wanted an excuse to do a mangrove stamp and they found this to be the one. But this again reminds you of all the development challenges that have been fought over, especially in Mumbai, where every time you have to build a bridge across either the Bombay Harbour or now as a new bridge is being proposed between Bombay and Vasai. There are always these challenges that you will be destroying mangroves. When the 2004 tsunami came on the eastern coast, I still remember how many discussions there were about how the mangroves would prevent Bombay being overrun by a tsunami and such things. So, as I said, I'm not a philatelist, but I let these act as little memorials, as little epigraphs of what we can and cannot talk about. Then issues to the river dolphin. So, twice India has given stamps to the Gangetic dolphin, uh, which is again now very critically endangered. This was India also loves doing these joint issues with other countries and highlighting common shared heritage between them. So here, this is a little odd though, because this is a freshwater dolphin uh, paired with a marine dolphin here. But nevertheless, again, showing that India does use these opportunities to use some form of memorialization. Similarly, the sea cow is from the Caribbean, so but I don't have much context on this stamp. So that much was our natural heritage. There are also a few issues on beaches uh, and a few other things, but I then decided to keep it quite curt because then the flavor of the lecture will not come out. But beaches are very important. Not only are they our natural heritage, but I will perhaps show in the later part of the lecture that they also are part of our maritime history in a very concrete way. But now let us move on to naval heritage. Well, I think a lot of India's stamp issuing in terms of maritime heritage has focused a lot on the Navy. So beginning with the organizations that support the tri-services, like the NDA or the DRDO, where the Navy stands shoulder to shoulder with the Air Force and the Army. Uh, Coming back again, yes, there has been a fair preponderance of Army stamps vis-a-vis Navy stamps when you come to the issuance of stamps. And I think the Air Force has fared even worse in this regard. Uh, Now, as a brat brought up in various cantonments, I'm only happy to see a lot of army stamps. But when I started researching for this subject, I wondered, of course, how so very little representation there is for the Navy. Here is one miniature sheet that I have on the BrahMos cruise missile. Now, this is the official etymology that it comes from the Brahmaputra and the Moskva rivers. But I don't know whether it delivers more. But this is one of India's pride and joys when it comes to its armaments, because this is one of the most important naval missiles that we have, and which is often said to be a force multiplier for the Navy. Yeah. Uh, that said, of course, the Navy, our Navy's blue water dreams have long been fueled by the possession of aircraft carriers. And we have stamps for the Vikrant and for the Vikramaditya. I wonder why there is no dedicated stamp for the INS Virat. Also, with the Vikrant itself, I feel I did work on a small historical project on the INS Vikrant, and therefore there is quite a bit that I know about it. And I wonder why, for example, a lot of that has not been featured. The Vikrant's spectacular participation in the 1971 war, for example, is barely uh, commemorated. Uh, I wish there would be a full series on the Vikrant someday, which would talk about its participation in the 71 war, the attacks on Chittagong and Cox's Bazar, the effective naval blockade of the Bay of Bengal, and also the very heroic way in which it sailed out of Bombay and transferred to the Eastern Command with one functional boiler, and somehow managing to repair the other boiler, and then onboarding the two fleets. You know, I wish there would be stamps on the commanders and the officers who participated. The fact that it has at least two MVCs and other things, but these are boys' wish lists. This is continuing with the Vikrant. This is the fleet of the White Tigers that embarked on the Vikrant, and I remember Commodore Medioma Bhara, sorry, my bad, telling me this very lovely story of how he served aboard the Vikrant and flew aboard it as part of the White Tigers, and his role in the bombing of Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. So these stamps, this particular stamp is rich in personal memory for me because of the stories that I've heard from him. Uh, then the other squadrons that were there. I mean, ideally there should be a stamp on every squadron, but at least these four squadrons that were again part of the Vikrant story. Uh, and one of the fun bits was trying to learn the pronunciation of Breguet Alize, which was the aircraft, piloted by the Cobras. So a lot of rich personal memories associated with this one stamp and the Vikrant stamp. Our Virat does get a sort of passing mention in one stamp, but that was part of the stamps he showed for two of the president's fleet reviews in Mumbai and in Vishakhapatnam, which highlight various ships of the Navy. Uh, uh, yeah, but I don't have much to say on those, except that I wish there would be more description on the stamp itself as to which ship this was. I have to keep going back to that sheet that they give, and now when it is taken out of context, like in a presentation like this, I can't keep going back to the sheet. Okay. Now, yet another fleet review chose to skip the Navy altogether, its modern ships, and decided to focus on the past. As I said, stamps are not really a medium to discuss the past or as chroniclers of the past, but because they are ultimately a propaganda arm of the state, especially when it comes to commemorative stamps. And with definitive stamps, though, that is another level of propaganda. But even when it comes to commemorative stamps, now this is where for whatever reason, they have chosen to issue stamps on the Pal and the Galbat, which were, of course, the flagship ships of the Maratha armor. And although they could have done a separate series on the armor itself, that is again a part of our heritage, not evidently out there on stamps. Then there is one on the Tarangani, which has its own independent stamp as well. And then a very abstract stamp that was probably the logo of the Fleet Review or something. I have no idea what that is supposed to represent. But coming back to the Fleet Reviews, a lot of pomp and circumstance, and clearly something that the government would definitely memorialize as a sort of projection of its power. Uh, what the stamps fairly poorly do is memorialize all the war participation. Okay, so here with some, there is one stamp for the 1965 war and the role of the Navy in blockading the Pakistan Navy at Karachi. This stamp is issued alongside stamps of the Army and the Air Force. But the role of the Navy has been, this is about one stamp that I have, and after looking up the internet for any older ones, this is all the one stamp that I got on the liberation of Goa. Again, the role of the Navy seems to be completely uh, forgotten in this. And this entire stamp seems to focus on the political aspect of the whole story. As for memorializing 1971, I haven't seen any stamps so far, since this is the 50th anniversary. I'm hoping by the end of the year there will be some very interesting stamps that we can talk about, and perhaps they will talk about this great ship, the Vikrant, that played such a core part in that war. Then on the role of the 1st and 16th battalions of the Punjab regiments, which have played important roles abroad, and therefore the representation of the ship that transported them across a lot of valor and sacrifice in the Mesopotamian campaign and in other campaigns of the First World War, reflected here. And there are many other regiments that have participated, and although there are stamps, they have not necessarily brought out the overseas part of those issues. Okay, so coming to even more naval heritage. In one thing India really loves is talking about its international diplomatic relationships. So that's why I call them little marine ambassadors. So here's one which talks about India's reaching out to its maritime neighbors. I think this was around the time of the founding of, I think, BIMSTEC and the Indian Ocean Rim organizations. So yes, but again, while we have a new alliance called the Quad. We have had these exercises of the Malabar. I wonder if there's going to be a stamp for that, and it would certainly have a lot of pride in my collection. You know, as an as a naval power in both ancient and medieval times, I think it is only our right. There is a certain reason why the Indian Ocean is named after us, and it is through things like this that I hope that again we will be able to justify the title of being lords of that ocean again. These are the daydreams of a Fauji child. Okay. Again, here's a stamp to the INS Kalvari. I think it was our first indigenously built submarine, which is probably why the government issued a stamp. We have at least the Indian Navy has long fulfilled the dream of Atmanirbhar Bharat before it became a popular buzzword. With a lot of indigenization, I think we build our own ships a lot more than we do other things. I mean, we're on the verge of commissioning our own and homemade aircraft carrier at the Cochin shipyard. It's such an interesting relationship that goes all the way. Admiral Krishnan, who was one of the strategists for using the INS Vikrants in the 71 war. I keep going back to the Vikrant; it's just my favorite ship of all time. The strategist who used the Vikrant, who lured the Ghazi into Vishakhapatnam harbor when it was blown up. As I was saying, the INS Kalvari sort of is a ambassador of the indigenization program. I hope there will be a stamp to the INS Arihant, or probably there is, and I'm not aware of it. But as I was talking of, indigenously built Indian ships. No, let's go back to the Kalvari. Uh, there's a nice little circle of a story that I like. That Commander Krishnan, not Eastern Fleet Commander Krishnan, uh, Gomati ma'am says it was a welcome experience for me when my family and I were invited on board the Anis Vikrant by Admiral Krishnan. Oh, there's so many stories. Yeah. So when he unfortunately did not make it as naval chief, and he was sent as managing director or director general of the Cochin shipyard, which is when he passed away, and therefore it sort of sounds like poetic justice that the new INS Vikrant is being built there, uh, and I hope it proves as a force multiplier in the Indian Ocean for us. So that is, one stamp can sometimes trigger a lot of memory. And some of this is imagined memory because I wasn't even born then. Yeah, but I have been on board the Vikrant when it was a museum ship. I still cherish all the souvenirs that I bought. Uh, so coming to a little more of our naval heritage, some of which you've already seen. This is the Tarangini, uh, which has gone on circumnavigation voyages. Another favorite ship of ours, very, very storied. Uh, you know, Growing up, I've read the stories of its route of circumnavigation. As I said, there was a previous stamp to its uh, when as part of the fleet review, and here's one which is all by itself for the Tarangini with this beautiful little miniature sheet. Uh, I always get two of everything, as an insurance policy. So if one is damaged, I still have the other. So I have two of these beautiful little sheets, and I have to sit and somehow I'm going to ask all the philatelists here as to how you stack the miniature sheets here, because my stamp albums they are often too big for it, and then I just have to keep them between the pages, and there's a risk of loss. So as I said, the 12-year-old and the 40-year-old will keep talking to each other throughout this lecture here. This is the Naval Dockyard and its 250th anniversary, which appeared in 1986. Okay. Vice Admiral Muralidharan says the logo of the fleet review was taken from the design of a ship observed in Mohenjo-daro. Then again, two more indigenously built ships, the Nilgiri and the INS Delhi. I know there is the Delhi class of ships. I'm not fully aware of. They're called frigates, I think. It's when you see little stamps like this and then you want to do a little more research. Then you sort of get, I think that's one reason why they said boys should all collect stamps when I was a young boy. Although I have still no idea why it was never considered a girl's hobby. But yes, I've learned a lot by looking at these stamps and then going back and reading about them. As a schoolboy, I would often either annoy my father, who was a military officer, but an army officer at that. So he could tell me about some of the regiments and all that, nothing about these ships. Or I would have to go to the school library and try and find out books. And then once the internet started happening in India in the late 90s, it was a world of a difference. Yeah. And then, of course, the Indian Coast Guard, lots of stories again that I have heard of I think frictions between the Navy and the Coast Guard, of the poor, it's a paramilitary force, not really an armed force. It is under the supervision of the Navy. Uh, I, but the few naval friends I have generally spoken a little disparagingly of the Coast Guard. The one Coast Guard friend that I have talks very frustratedly of the Navy. So very interesting relationships. Yet the two organizations work quite well when it comes to protecting the coast. Although of course a few incidents have happened, like for example this U.S. naval ship that chose to trespass in our waters, or the two Italians who killed our fishermen and then were arrested by, I'm not sure whether it was the Coast Guard or the Navy. And very interesting stories. The slips that happened during the 93 arms landings at Dabhol, was it, when when these arms reached Bombay and led to the bombings. So yeah, my viewpoint of the Coast Guard is not entirely very rosy, but at the same time, it has done its share of defending the nation. Now, from naval heritage, let's finally move on to a bit of our merchant heritage. So my book tends to be a little mixed up. It's not like I have all the stamps of the Navy in one place and everything else in another place. I don't have as many stamp books as I should need or want. But now almost 20 years into the new millennium, I think they've almost stopped making these books. It's very hard to find them. But let's move on. So celebrating our civilian maritime heritage, uh, are, well, we've got stamps so far for three ports: Mumbai, Visakhapatnam, and Kolkata. And well, we have a whole lot of other ports as well, and I'm sure there will be new stamps for them in the future. One of the things that I really find about the Indian Postal Service is the number of stamps it issues celebrating itself. So every time there is an Indipex or a state level exhibition or a international exhibition, there is a whole bunch of new stamps issued to commemorate that thing. And otherwise, on its own anniversaries, on its things it commemorates. So there are a lot of stamps commemorating post office buildings, postmen in remote areas. It romanticizes itself like no other government department can. I don't think Doordarshan has issued like a commemorative video about itself, or AIR has made a broadcast celebrating itself. You know, so this is one department that can afford to romanticize itself, and it has never left that opportunity. But here's this one very interesting story of the SS Hindustan, ship built in 1852, and I think it sank off Calcutta in 1867. Uh, what I find most interesting is that the very British flag that's there on the ship, they have not chosen to blur it out or pretend that it didn't exist, but they've acknowledged the colonial history of the stamp. My own personal picture is so horrible, so I have chosen to borrow it from the internet. Uh, I also have terrible difficulty photographing stamps. Most of them are of a glossy finish, especially all the new commemorative ones, and it has been a nightmare trying to photograph them. And the other is the river mail boat, which is I've not been able to find much information on that. When was this used and all? But I'm sure the post office has its archives, and from where it pulled out all these lovely beautiful things. Yes, here is again one of those beautiful joint issues that India so loves doing with countries. It does them with all kinds of countries, whether good or bad. So I have in my collections an India-Mongolia joint issue, an India-Belarus joint issue, among others. So here we are celebrating Deen Dayal Port at Kandla, which is a new container terminal, uh, and also India's very strategic investment at Chabahar in Iran, which is just next to the Gulf of Hormuz and is supposed to run the Hormuz Strait, sorry, not the Gulf of Persia, the Strait of Hormuz, and is supposed to be our gateway into Western Afghanistan, which has, as you know, I India's attempts of I don't know, call it diplomacy, call it strategy, call it what you will. Chabahar irritates both China because of India trying to encircle Pakistan, and also it irritates the US because of the overt relationship with Iran. So it's quite the sack of coals that India is negotiating, and yet quite an interesting story as it develops over the years. Okay, then looking at shipping pioneers, and when you you have to begin with Ardashir Wadia, the famous person who was brought or lured, or depending on different people's way of looking at it, from Surat, where he was building ships for the Mughals, to Bombay by the East India Company to set up the fleet of ships, and of course the founder of what would now be the Mazagon docks, and the builder of some very famous ships like the Trincomalee, which is the oldest ship of the UK Navy, now sits in dry dock, and USS Minden, very famous for being the place where the US national anthem was written. And so, yes, but there are far better historians of the Mazagon docks than I am. And I'm sure there has already been a lecture, or there will be a lecture on this very storied institution, and also this very storied gentleman. Two people that are not much talked about outside Tamil Nadu, but also shipping pioneers in their own right, are V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, and this is a stamp from the 70s, and Sri Pitti Tyagaraja. Now, Chidambaram Pillai, most Tamils don't realize that this is what he looks like, because if you say his name, they will immediately think of the actor Shivaji Ganeshan, because of the film that was made called Kappalotiya Tamilan. And behind you see the SS Gallia, which was the one ship of the Swadeshi Steamship Company, which was the first Indian navigation company. Did not last very long. Chidambaram Pillai was jailed, and when he was in jail, his company was forcibly dissolved to protect British interests. And then he has generally faded into history, although apparently uh, when he went to jail and his company was dissolved, apparently a lot of Indians in South Africa raised money for him, and then which was handed to Mohandas Gandhi to give it to him. And for some reason, the money that Mohandas gave him did not seem to tally with the accounts of the money he was supposed to receive. And there were a lot of exchanges that went back and forth between them. So today, in fact, in Tamil, we have a term called Gandhi Kanaku, or Gandhi's accounting, which means an accounting process that has no end to it. Such complex accounts that you have no idea where to start and where to begin. So it's this gentleman who gave us not only our first shipping company, but also a very, very memorable term in the Tamil language. The right side is Sri Pitti Tyagarayar. Now, for most people, he is the pioneer of the self-respect movement, which later morphed into the Dravidar Karagam, which later morphed into the DMK and all the other splinter Karagams. And therefore, he is only seen as a political pioneer, but he also owned interests in shipping and traded across the ocean frequently with Burma and Malaya and others. And therefore, as a shipping pioneer, he is now barely known, not even in Tamil Nadu. Okay, although to his credit, uh, there is an entire suburb of Chennai named after him. Although nobody will ever, if you ask people there where is Tyagaraya Nagar, no one will have a clue. You have to ask them all where is T Nagar. Yes, this is a gentleman we reduced to one letter of the alphabet. Okay. Uh, Yet another pioneer is T.S. Narayan Swamy, founder of the South Indian Shipping Corporation. Although he is now better known as the founder of the company that is Indian Cements, whose claim to fame north of Tamil Nadu is as the notional employer of, he's the owner of the Chennai IPL team.
Mr. Dhoni.
Yes, thank you so much. Mr. Mahendra Singh Dhoni, I suddenly blanked out for a lot. Right? But again, another southern magnate with relationships to shipping. On the right, of course, you see this the very famous Narottam Morarji, after whom we have the, it's called Shipping Day or Maritime Day. I think one of those two. This is Venkat's territory. I usually don't step into it, but you have already heard a very, very detailed lecture on Indian versus British shipping by Venkat. Another pioneer of whom there's no direct stamp, so I've used the stamp about the David Sassoon Library, is Sassoon himself, a trader who had presence all the way from Suez to Shanghai. With members of his family placed all over the place, trading, perhaps on British ships, perhaps on Indian ships. A Baghdadi refugee who built a massive fortune in Bombay, and then in turn left behind quite a lot of the city's landmarks. Whether directly or through his sons, but the Sassoon Library, the Sassoon Dock, the Messina Hospital. There's a lot that the Sassoons have left behind for us. The Sassoon Hospital in Pune, on top of it. The absolutely beautiful Ohel David Synagogue. I wish there would be a stamp to that someday. So another big guy who made his name in shipping. And then on the right, you see the Indian Merchants Chamber, a beautiful Art Deco building that stands next to Churchgate Station today, but with again a storied history that one day probably Venkat will give us an entire lecture on. Again, empowering Indian trade, financing it, lobbying with the government. At a time when the British were very, very keen on maintaining monopoly over sea trade and making sure that Indians did not float their own ships. This was one of the organizations that tried to lobby its way out of this predicament. Yeah, then study in contrast. So on the left, you see the, I think probably one of the most hated Indian governmental organizations, the customs. And there are stories, I think, and movies and things about when India had a really draconian customs regime in the 70s and 80s. This famous Coffee Posa Act. I used to wonder why such a draconian act had such an interesting name, but Control of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Act. Still very much in part of the law. And but you would growing up, you would hear all kinds of stories about midnight chases and raids on people who were smuggling things, and there would be landings on the beach. And I think Amitabh Bachchan did his share to heroize the smuggler in movies like Dawn and Amar Akbar Anthony. Uh, I don't know if there's been a movie which made a hero out of a customs officer. Usually, it's a police officer who prevents, who raids. But it would be an interesting discussion. On the other side is an absolutely opposite, the Standard Chartered Bank, which was founded to empower commerce. Uh, as I said, Standard Chartered Bank was founded by the same person who founded the Indian Income Tax Department. So you would call them star-crossed siblings, but again, an organization with presence across East Asia, India, Singapore, meant to power the trade between Europe and Asia, and based out of a very beautiful building in Mumbai. I think my dear friend Venkat's once former employer, he will of course be able to wax a lot more eloquent on this bank. But I just wanted to sort of play these two off each other. One that is meant to restrict trade and prevent illegal activities, and the other that sometimes bends the rules to enable transactions for its clients. Although not, it does not have so as much a reputation as the HSBC, which I think has recently been caught in a wide variety of scandals. Now, this is something unorthodox, but why would you bring railways as part of maritime heritage? Well, barring the old Delhi station, the other three stations are the premier stations of the British presidency cities. All three are coastal, and if were it not for the maritime trade, I don't think railways would ever have had the amount of impetus that they ever had. Colonial historians have talked about the railways as being nothing more than an instrument of the colonial state to harness resources from the hinterland, move them to the coasts, and finally ship them off to Europe. But even if we do not attribute any such motive to them, it is impossible to say that the sea did not influence the building of the railways. So I thought these should be part of our maritime heritage. And look, and I don't think when the postal department issued these stamps, it ever thought like this. But when I was looking out at stamps, I said, well, you can't de-integrate them like that. Another thing is lighthouses. Now, although we are full of lighthouses, and many of them with stories that go back way past, like for example, the the Kanderi lighthouse. Here are three celebrating Minikoi, Mahabalipuram, and Alapura. Although there are now, there are dozens more, and I'm sure all of them have their own histories and stories. When we were growing up in Goa, one of the things was the lighthouse at Mormugao. It was directly visible from my house at a fair distance away. Not Mormugao, sorry, at Aguada, my bad. And it was a thing at night to, peer out of the window and just look at the sunset and the gleam of the rotating light as it went around. Well, I can have a long wish list of all the stamps that I wish the government would issue, but then it has to take care of a whole lot of other things as well. 70% of all the stamps it issues are in the memory of some or the other MP, MLA, political bigwig, RSS character, Congress chamcha. I speak very frankly, but I have in my collection a whole host of stamps to some obscure Baba and well, let me not talk about those. So yeah, so when in the middle of it the government gets some time, I wish it we should talk more about these things. What it has also completely forgotten about are our ancient pots. Yeah, so but that I'll come to later. So these are a couple of stamps on oil exploration, both celebrating Bombay High, which, as far as I know, even today is our only offshore rig. Now coming to maritime history, which is my specialization and joy. I picked the monuments at Pattadakal to make a point. Now, Pattadakal is deep inside Karnataka, and you would really wonder what it has anything to do with maritime heritage. But it was the capital trio of the Badami Chalukyas, along with Badami and Ayyavale, or Aihole as it is known. And that triggered a whole lot of talk about the ancient trading guilds, the ancient and medieval trading guilds, of which the most prominent were the Ayyavale Ainurvar, or the 500 lords of Ayyavale, who traded everywhere between Egypt and southern China, there are epigraphic relics of theirs spread in this entire trading region. They also financed the Chalukyan and later the Chola navies. And there are the other guilds like the Anjuvanam, the Nanadesi. They're well studied by archaeologists and historians of the maritime, but not otherwise as well known in the Indian historic consciousness as perhaps they should be. Uh, for some reason, much of our textual history seems to suggest that we are a landlubber country with, despite having a gigantic coastline, we seem not to have had proud maritime heritage at all, which is utterly patently false. But when I grew up and when I was exposed to whatever the CBSE textbooks considered history, I never heard of any of all of this. So this is what I wanted to bring out. Uh, yes, the stamp was issued for a completely different reason, which is to highlight the sculptural excellence at Adil Desai asked, is Ayyavali the same as Aihole? Yes, it is. It is absolutely the same place. Yeah. So while a stamp is of course intended on commemorating the sculptural beauty, which is of course beyond compare, I just thought this would be a trigger for me to talk about something that we don't usually talk about. Then talking of ships, okay, and again not very well understood. So you have from 2200 BC, which would place it in Harappan times, a ship and which is apparently modeled on a seal, uh, and then something from 1700 AD, which I am not sure, looks to me like a Portuguese galleon. Uh, I can't tell my galleon from a galley for saving my life. Uh, Although I love maritime history, I am quite a bit of Luddite in that. But what I found very interesting uh, is this coin, which is probably from Satvahana times, and the legend for it, Shanno Varuna, which is now the Navy's motto, and which means protect us, O Varuna. The name Varuna has, apart from being the sea god, he also lent his name to two items that the Indians were very fond of importing from the Romans. So during the period of the Indo-Roman trade, there was one major complaint that the Indians weren't keen on buying any Roman goods. They were only interested in gold and silver as bullion, and in two things that came loaded in amphorae from Rome, Shvetavaruni and Raktavaruni, uh, which ultimately mean nothing but white wine and red wine. So at some point of time, it was certainly very much a part of at least Western coastal Indian culture to drink white and red wine. Uh, though I suppose anyone who touches them today would be considered westernized. I think the term for such people is coconut because they are brown outside and white inside. But we can always use perhaps these stamps to argue that drinking white and red wine is very much a part of Indian culture. Okay? Few historic figures. I have consciously left out Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Uh, Sadly, all the stamps that depict him seem to ignore his enormous contribution to building up the Maratha Navy and envisioning that the naval threat to India was one of the greatest threats which she faced. Here are two stamps that commemorate Kunjali Marikyar, the commander of the Samutri Raja of Kannur, okay, also known better to us as the Zamorin of Kozhikode, sorry, not Kannur, Samutri Raja of Calicut, uh, uh, and this one whose navy participated in this terrible battle of Diu, which probably one of the craziest alliances ever built. Venetians, Ottomans, the Gujarat Sultanate, and the Samutri Raja, all of them up against the Portuguese. Unfortunately for them, that was a battle that they lost, leaving the Portuguese supreme in the Arabian Sea and being able to control everything from Hormuz to Daman, and then also in parts of the southern Arabian Sea. The right side, you see the much storied Rajendra Chola the First and his famous naval empire that stretched all the way from Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka to Tamil Nadu, which sometimes gives, one of the things that Indian history is proud of and that's taught to all of us in school is that India never invaded anyone else. And while it's almost like a national founding myth that we are this great nation of peace, the great nation of Ashoka, the peaceful ruler, the great nation of Akbar, of all peaceful kings. But we forget that India has had its share of invading other countries. Rajendra Chola is the prime example of leading a navy that invaded Malaysia and Indonesia. Then there is the famous Kalinga invasion of Sri Lanka, which in Sri Lanka is spoken of with great horror as a devastating phenomenon, and which we have never heard of. So we see Kalinga as not as a maritime naval power, but as the victim of Ashoka. Otherwise, the state tends to pass out in history, unless you're from Odisha board. Then Kanhoji Angre, although I do not have a direct stamp for him, is nevertheless commemorated in the Pal and the Galbat and the Ghurab that you saw in the earlier maritime heritage stamps. Temples. Now, why on earth would a talk on maritime heritage have anything to do with temples? Well, for one reason is the three that I've included and a whole lot of others that I have left out, because there are a lot of temples in this country, is that these were also centers that financed the guilds and the maritime trade. We've all heard the famous story of Somnath, which was ransacked many times, but it was a coastal temple, and It was known to be the store of currency through which the ships would borrow from the temple, set out on their sailing expeditions, come back, give it back, maybe also give a generous donation and things like that. And then you have these temples scattered all over the coast, whether it is the famous Somnath, whether it is the Kanyakumari temple, Padmanabha Swami, Rameshwaram, Brihadishwarar, and these two beautiful temples at Srikakulam. Again, when they issued the stamp, I don't think they had any clue that I'm going to use them to talk about maritime heritage. In fact, the Sri Kurmam temple has been commemorated because it is the one major temple celebrating the Kurma Avtara of Vishnu. Yes, but it's in Srikakulam, which is a coastal town, and therefore I wanted to bring up the role of these temples. Some of them, like at Mahabalipuram, also have very, very tall, what famously called pagodas, and what we call shikhara. So apart from acting as financial centers, they also acted as markers. So when you're sailing along the coast and you see the shikhara, or sometimes the gopuram rather than the shikhara, because some of the in South Indian temples often the shikhara isn't half as tall as the gopuram. So when you see the gopuram or the shikhara, you immediately know which temple it is, and therefore roughly which area you are in, and therefore you know what to look out for. If there are sandbanks, if there are submerged rock beds, then you know how to navigate. So many of these temples also act as navigation aids. They are one of the writers on India's maritime heritage is the scholar Himanshu Prabha Rai, and I would personally be willing to give an arm and a leg to bring her to the MMMS to talk about our maritime heritage on the basis of archaeology. But it wasn't only temples. In the colonial period, you also have these soaring churches, like the Sacred Heart Church. I think it's at Tuticorin, and the Basilica at Vailankanni. Again, the tall church spires functioning as lookouts. Also, again, though it was no intention that these were meant to be maritime stamps, they show the interaction of religions over the sea, whether it, whether it is Indian temples that were built abroad, like for example the Kaiyuan temple in southern China, where there used to be a proper Tamil temple with Shikhara, Gopuram, everything from the 13th century, because there was a little Tamil colony living there. Or it is the beautiful ones at Angkor Wat or Borobudur, which show the Indians taking religion to their religion eastwards. Or when you see these beautiful churches that talk of the religions that came from the west over the sea. So that is yet another aspect of our maritime heritage. We've seen David Sassoon, of course, celebrated as an individual, but we don't have stamps for all the maritime communities that have been here, whether it is the Siddhis of Janjira. We sadly don't have a stamp for Janjira at all, despite it being such a beautiful fort and such an important player in the history of coastal Maharashtra. Nor do we have stamps for any of the other coastal forts, sadly. And if you are aware of them, please bring them to my notice. Yes, so this is something that talks about how our religions have crossed seas and a part of our heritage that came from across the waves. Okay, and then coming to a close now, this is as unorthodox as it can get. Yeah, so this was the stamp that I was going to use to talk to you about the Kaiyuan temple. But the Mahabodhi temple again talks of the spread of Buddhism, both over land and oversea routes from India to the east. And on right is a language which is very deeply mixed up in India's maritime heritage, because it was the language of the intrepid traders who sailed over the Bay of Bengal into the Malay archipelago and then through the South China Sea right up to the Chinese coast. And you therefore have inscriptions in Tamil dotted all over these places, from China, from Singapore, from Malaysia, Indonesia. So this is one of those long, long before, say, Portuguese became the language of the Indian Ocean and was later replaced by English. There was a time when Tamil had flourished as maybe not the lingua franca, but as a sort of trade language. In fact, a Japanese linguist by the name of Susumu Ono has suggested a very radical theory that the Japanese language is nothing but a creole of the Tamil and Chinese languages. Now, I speak Tamil quite well. I speak Chinese fairly okay, but I still can't understand Japanese. So I don't get how he said it. But that just again goes to prove that Indian traders had no problem going all that far. I mean, there is also stories of a princess from Ayodhya, taking a ship all the way from India to Korea, where she married and became a Korean queen and introduced many Indianisms. The Korean system of writing is certainly inspired by the Indian scripts. So I suppose there is an iota of truth to these things, and of course, huge amount of Buddhism. And yes, I mean, I decided not to bore you with too many stamps, and I'm done.